Kia ora. I'm Anne O'Brien, Director of the Auckland Writers' Festival, and you're listening to the session podcast How Lucky Were We from our 2018 programme. Bitingly clever satire delivered with a well-timed drollness marked John Clarke's work, which included the black singleted gumboot-cladded Fred Dagg, the alternative national anthem We Don't Know How Lucky We Are, the groundbreaking mockumentary The Games, and weekly skits on the absurdities of Australian political life with longtime collaborator Bryan Dawe. To mark his death and the republication of his novel, The Tournament, alongside two other writing collections, friends and colleagues Tom Scott and Michael Heyward gather with Clarke's daughter Lorin, herself an accomplished writer, to pay tribute to this remarkable man. The session is chaired by Gemma Gracewood. We hope you enjoy it.
And I made a point to introduce all three of you as John's friends, because something that came through in all the tributes that I was reading since John died was that everybody seemed to write about what an incredible friend he was and how wonderful he was at beginning and then maintaining friendships. And a lovely question for a Sunday afternoon is, what can we all learn about friendship from John?
Well, Dad was an enthusiast above all else. Quite often people would say to me, I had a chat to your dad at the thing the other night. I did not know that he was so interested in bicycles or World War II or whatever. And he always was interested in just about anything. And particularly in people, and he actually, when asked what his influences were, he used to list. He could list people like Spike Milligan and Peter Cook and Ruth Draper and Joyce Grenfell and the list of people. But his first answer was always talk, and he grew up in a family with parents who were really good at talking, which he talks about in Tinkering. He's written some more recently. He started writing these more sort of reflective pieces and biographical snapshots. And so he loved that. He loved listening as a kid to the adults in the next room and the cousins chattering, and I think if you read anything by him, you can see that, can't you? And that's about making human connections and friendships and so on.
Michael, you've been publishing him for so long, more than 20 years, but presumably have had a friendship that entire time as well.
And talk was it. We would occasionally hold signings, and the people at the back of the queue needed a mountain tent and survival rations, because by the time John had a proper chat with everyone who wanted a book signed, it was dusk and starting to rain. So he loved all of that. The other thing about John was, if I had something I wanted to ask him, would he be interested in doing something? So I'd call, and he was always a wonderful man to call on a boring day in the office, because it would smarten up very quickly. But John never said no. He never, ever said no to anything. But I knew as I was talking to him, the longer the answer went, the more and once we got on to Tibet or whatever it was a very clear no, but then we just ended up having a wonderful chat. So no, talk, and the other part of talk was, and I think this is reflected just in how good his ear was and how sort of clean his concept of his writing was he listened. He was an amazing listener, and he was extremely good at hearing those sort of those little phrases that we sew into our speech to get us to where we want to go, and which he could then duplicate to enormous comic effect.
And Tom, you've known John the longest of anyone here. What?
You before Lorin.
Yes, obviously before Lorin.
Don't be silly, I've known him my whole life.
I heard about John. I was a student at Massey, and honestly, hearing about John was like hearing about Jesus of Nazareth, of comedy. People came up from Wellington back to Palmerston for the holidays, and they would say, "You've got to meet this guy, John Clarke. He's a wee bit like you, way better than you." And He's just terrifically funny. So I knew about John. His legend spread back to Palmerston North, and it took me 2 years before I finally met him, and he was every bit as good as everyone described. He was just the most amazingly funny man. And what I liked about John, his comedy had the quality of an ice puck. It just was effortless. We all strained and sweated and worked hard and tried hard to be funny. For John, it just seemed like a Federer backhand. He was just apparently effortless.
It's interesting to hear you, Michael, say that he would say no to things eventually, because a friend of mine who works in Melbourne government wrote to him once to ask if they could show a video at a very big conference with a lot of Melbourne transport people. And he came back to her immediately and said, yes, that would be fine, but what would be even better is that Bryan and I could come along. We'd happily come along. This is Clarke and Dawe, the amazing partnership. And she went, oh, this is thrilling, and went to her boss, and in a twist that John no doubt would have loved, they went, oh, no, that'd be a bit too interesting for this conference. But I wonder how it felt to share him, because he seems to have been so generous with his time and his words. And
yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because, of course, when somebody's been your dad your whole life, you kind of don't have another dad to compare it to, so you don't really know what it's like. People used to say, or still do, what's it like to have had him as a dad, and you kind of... The only answer to that really is, which is, I think, true and kind of is what you're maybe getting at with the friends question, is it's kind of how you would imagine it would be. So, he kind of was all of those things, and sharing him, was never something that it's something that kind of, since he's been gone, has been something that has kind of changed things. But yeah, he was such a... He talked to everybody, so he'd be up the back and at a thing like this, and you'd walk out and you'd say, what did you think? And he'd say, I thought this, and I thought that was very interesting, and this right now. The guy at the door, grandfather from Tipperary, married to, interestingly, a scientist, and he, had a big chat about that with whoever that was. And so, I suppose there are lots of people whose dads are like that, and that just was a kind of bigger version of that.
Yeah, well, but, in comedy, the pleasure he gave us all was so immense. And where many comics and artists tend to wear the heavy crown of fame, he seems to have been endlessly delighted in life. And, for all we know, his mental health was really actually quite great. And I'm wondering what some of the secret domestic ingredients are that ensured that.
I think he was... The word that I started with kind of, I think, is, that enthusiasm, that kind of curiosity about people and life and so on, which a lot of writers have. I think that was something that he had always had, and continued to delight in. And I think, that extended to his relationship with his audience, so that he loved it when the audience got involved. For instance, farnarkling, which you mentioned earlier, he went on TV in Australia and did farnarkling, which was a made-up sport, and which was very seriously discussed, using very sporty language and so on. And he went on TV and he did this, and people started writing letters to the paper saying, a disgraceful article from Dave Sorensen on the weekend, and really getting into this fake sport. to the point where, after Dad died, we were a nice man from the newspaper, The Age in Australia, wrote to us and said, "I've got a file about this big, full of letters regarding whānākling from very concerned citizens writing about various events during the whānākling, during, the most recent article and so on." And that sort of thing, he had that, he enjoyed that with his audience. I think the other example I can think of is when he was doing Fred Dagg and he went on TV, I think, and he said that the election was coming up, and he just offhandedly said that he thought he'd give it a run. And a few people crossed out the candidates on their forms and wrote F Dagg, as instructed by him. And he enjoyed that relationship. And there are a couple of quotes that I mentioned this in the introduction to Tinkering. There were two things that I remember him particularly enjoying his audience saying to him. And he always said, I come from my audience, like I'm at an advantage because I was sitting there as an audience member, or he was a listener and a watcher and so on, and listened to all the people around him and so on. So he always thought he came from his audience, but he said there were two things that that people came up to him and said. One of them was somebody said, he was playing golf one day, and somebody said, "Hi, I like your stuff." And he said, "Oh, thank you, we're just trying to help." And he said, and this bloke said, "Yeah, it's like a secret between you and the audience." Ooh. And he loved that. And the other one was specifically about Clarke and Dawe, and it was a woman, and she said to him, "Oh, I really like what you do. Because," what was it? I've got to get I wrote it down beforehand. Oh, yeah, because that's it. Because when I watch Clarke and Dawe, I have a straight face, and then I laugh at the news. So that's what I wrote down earlier, because I thought that's the best example of him enjoying that relationship with his audience. Yeah.
Well, on that note, let's watch a clip from John's most famous and enduring collaboration. This is Clarke and Dawe. Well, let's unpack that. Let's talk about the magic ingredients in John's writing and his love of form. I mean, he really was a comedian of language. Tom, would you like to go there? Sorry, Michael.
Well, you can't follow that.
I know. No one can follow that, but unfortunately we still have 43 minutes to go. So.
I think the use of form, the word form you used, the tinkering, we found that a lot, didn't we, when we were looking through all of the materials and putting together this, that form, which he talked about explicitly in relation to writing generally whenever that was sort of discussed, form was something he treasured as a writer. So, there are things in here, for instance, there are a few things in here that are not anywhere else, that are sort of never been published before, including letters from the school to the parents of some recalcitrant birds, which, because Dad loved photography, and almost as much as he loved bicycles. No, he did actually love photography, and he took photographs of these of birds a lot, and he kind of borrowed the form of the stern letter home from the principal, and he borrowed form a lot. In Clarke and Dawe, for instance, he often said, "Wouldn't have happened." It was significant anyway that it was in the context, for the first, I think, 20 years, it was in the context of serious current affairs shows. So first on Channel 9 in Australia and then on the ABC, it was the final 3 minutes of the evening current affairs shows, and it required that seriousness. That form kind of set it up, and the interview format as well. There are many other examples of form in here.
One of my favourites is the writing about 10-year-olds and 5-year-olds and, you know, childhood as if he were writing policy analysis, which is, what are some of your favourites, Michael?
Well, you know, when you hear, I mean, those interviews are as precisely constructed as a sonnet. And they're intensely written. And as Lorin says, it's to do with the form of television. There was 90 seconds or 2 minutes, and it had to fit exactly. But even before that, I think, you know, as a Kiwi in Australia, John had the advantage of that insider-outsider view, and the first thing he saw was just how ridiculous Australian politics is, and he was just, you know, the opening interview in the collection is with Paul Keating, and Paul Keating's opening words are "Pleasure to be here, have some brie," you know, and he would absolutely cut, he would just cut straight away, and so having. You know, John loved games. I mean, he really did love sport, and he revered athletes and sports people. But he also, what he really loved was the language of sports commentary, and he loved the sort of persona, and it comes out of Fred Dagg, of the sort of deranged commentator, the deranged pundit, and in the derangement that allows him to speak the truth. And so he was constantly making verbal games and creating new sets of rules for himself, and having sort of worked out what the rules were and what the language was, that then gave him the freedom to say whatever it was that he wanted to say. So, you know, when an author turns up in your office saying, "Look, I've got a book that might interest you, Michael. It's a tennis tournament, and there's a full men's draw, and there's a full women's draw, and there's a full doubles draw, men's and women's, and a full mixed draw, and it's basically everyone."
And I want to list the results.
Yeah, and showed and the results.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the thoughts of Chairman Mao, sort of like it was enormous, and said, I think we should publish this. And when someone presents you with something that is so logically thought out and so clearly bonkers, right? It's, you know, and I don't know whether any of you have read The Tournament, but it is ludicrously funny because, you know, it's Picasso and it's Woody Allen and it's, you know, Diaghilev and it's everybody playing tennis. One of my favourite exchanges is when Ayn Rand's drawn to play Beatrix Potter, and so they, you know, do the coin toss at the net, and Beatrix says, you know, "Good luck, Ayn," and Ayn says, "Get out of my way, Beatrix, or I'll fucking kill you."
Good. Tom, what was it like to have John write for you, to have those words delivered to you?
Well, I was going to say he held a funhouse mirror up to reality. He had bureaucratic language, and he just stepped to a parallel line alongside it, and you heard politicians' words and politicians' languages and cliches and subterfuge coming straight back at you. And I was going to say, just reminded today, this is the royal wedding, obviously, yesterday. The first time I ever heard John, before I even met him, was the Princess Anne Captain Mark Phillips wedding, and it was, I don't know if Barney put the single out, it was on New Zealand radio, and John did it as Peter Kelly, a famous New Zealand racing commentator, and Captain Mark Phillips and Princess Anne are here in the holding pen, waiting for the just waiting for the balloon to go up, and they're on the way down the aisle at Westminster Abbey. And he did it, a whole race inside the Westminster Abbey. Captain Mark Phillips and Princess Anne, and she was drawing ahead and he was drawing ahead. And the last line was the killer line, "Princess Anne by a nose." Yeah. And you just thought, God, this guy is great. Then I met him and we clicked, and I was thrilled. If you made John laugh, John would go, John thought something was really good. You might get a, yeah. Yeah, and that was high praise from John. If you made him laugh, my God, you've won the jackpot. And he would read stuff out to me, and I'd read stuff out to him, and his stuff was incredibly funny and original. And you can still pull out the masquerade we did together. It was so successful, it ended up with thousands in my garage because the students at Massey didn't want it because it wasn't vulgar. That's the first time I've ever heard John say fuck in anything. John was actually...
No, it was Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand.
Wasn't John Clarke?
Yeah.
Were you witness to John doing Peter Kelly into an empty beer jug, which apparently was a specialty?
He did it.
He put your head in the beer jug.
I heard about it. But John's generosity as an artist, when he was performing this at Victoria University, a famous race with sort of fleas or ants or something across the floor of an empty stage, and whenever John's flea got behind, he stood on it, or it stood on the rivals. But a strange little boy, intense, weird little boy called Paul Holmes came up to him and said, I can do a better Peter Kelly than you. And because Paul had been sickly as a kid and listened to radio a lot, same as John had listened to a lot of radio. And John generously gave this fantastic sketch to Paul Holmes, and Paul Holmes performed it thereafter. And one famous occasion at the Chateau, when they did a show, and the first half was just dreadful. No one was laughing. Jeanette MacDonald was in it, John Banners, and John Clarke, of course, and Paul Holmes. And all these Hawke's Bay hoons were not the least bit amused at this show from Wellington. Then Paul came out and did the Peter Kelly routine, and it brought the house down. Then the people said, we'll give you some more money if you do the whole show again, because they'd warmed up by then. So they did the whole show again, and it was funny from start to finish. And Paul Holmes, doing John's material, was the absolute star. Went up to the bar afterwards, and all these Hawke's Bay guys in by yellow shirts and needle cords said, yeah, can I buy you a beer, mate? Paul said, oh, well, no, I'd prefer a gin and tonic. No, stay in character. Stay, do it as that like. Paul said, I would like a gin and tonic if you don't mind. A gin and tonic is what I would prefer at this point in time. I think a gin and tonic is what I would like. I'd be most desirous of a gin and tonic. And that became Paul's voice for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And it's... John, the one thing John can be criticised for is he foisted Paul Holmes on the rest of it. So. But he gave a fantastic sketch away to another artist because John was that confident in himself. He had confidence and he had calm, and he was brilliant.
I mean, something that's so significant about John's comedy is that Fred Dagg, the black singlet, the gumboots aside, he never went for wigs and costumes. How did that give more power to his comedy?
You might be better at this one.
Well, I think the genius of the interviews was that, I mean, John was a phenomenally gifted parodist. You know, he wrote this book called The Even More Complete Book of 20th Century Verse, which is as good a book of parodies of the English tradition that you could ever hope to read. He had an absolutely brilliant ear, but the genius of the interviews, the political interviews, is that he, you know, because we're very used to political satire where someone pretends to be Bob Hawke or Piggy Muldoon or whoever it is, was that he was playing John Clarke being a political satirist, and that allowed him enormous freedom. I also think that the other thing about John, his satire was ruthless, absolutely ruthless, but that combined with something that was essentially genial. You never felt, even when people were on the receiving end of his satire, that anybody was being diminished at all. There was something intensely celebratory about the whole thing, and I think that's because John was a really serious writer, and actually he was at the service of truth, and so it took him into a zone beyond. He would never pick on people. That kind of thing he hated, but he did really care about what the truth was, and that's why his audience loved him, and that's why you had to watch Clarke Dawe with a straight face and then laugh at the news. You know.
That's a beautiful segue to our next video, which is an excerpt from the series The Games. Who saw The Games? Okay. For those who didn't, it was a comedy series about the organisers of the 2000 Sydney Olympics, and who, of course, included John Clarke and Bryan Dawe and several of their comedy friends. And this was a seminal television moment within the series in that Talkback Radio went absolutely nuts that night and the next day and for several days afterwards. In this episode, several nations have been threatening to boycott the Olympics over Australia's refusal to apologise for 200 years of injustice towards their First Nations people. And the team behind the Games are trying to come up with a solution. Play the video.
Just before we play it, the one thing you need to know is that it was John Howard as Prime Minister who was refusing to issue an apology. There was an actor, very well-known actor in Sydney, whose name was John Howard. So John thought, right, let's get John Howard to do the apology that he won't do. So,
Here we go.
the actor's name you're watching is John Howard.
Hello.
Here we go.
Oh, hi.
How's your meeting with the Aboriginal people?
Well, you know, what can you say? I totally agree with you, but what can I do?
That's what the Germans said, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is pretty much. Under the circumstances, it's a little bit difficult to get enthusiastic about running a whole lot of running races out here, isn't it?
I've got an answer.
I'm delighted to hear it, Gina. Coffee and Anne can't work it out. The International Court in The Hague reckon it's beyond their jurisdiction. I can't tell you how pleased I am that you've bowled it over.
Look at this.
Well, what is it?
We send this overseas.
Yeah, what is it?
The rest of the world wants John Howard to apologise.
Yeah, correct.
Sit down.
Good evening. My name is John Howard, and I'm speaking to you from Sydney, Australia, host city of the year 2000 Olympic Games. At this important time, and in an atmosphere of international goodwill and national pride, we here in Australia, all of us, would like to make a statement before all nations. Australia, like many countries in the New World, is intensely proud of what it's achieved in the past 200 years. We're a vibrant and resourceful people. We share a freedom born in the abundance of nature, the richness of the earth, the bounty of the sea. We are the world's biggest island. We have the world's longest coastline. We have more animal species than any other country. 2/3 of the world's bird species are native to Australia. We are one of the few countries on Earth with our own sky. We are a fabric woven of many colours, and it's this that gives us our strength. However, these achievements have come at a great cost. We've been here for 200 years, but before that, there was a people living here. For over 40,000 years, they lived in perfect balance with the land. There were many Aboriginal nations, just as there were many Indian nations in North America and across Canada, as there were many Maori tribes in New Zealand, and Incan and Mayan peoples in South America. These indigenous Australians lived in areas as different from one another as Scotland is from Ethiopia. They lived in an area the size of Western Europe. They didn't even share a common language, yet they had their own laws, their own beliefs, their own ways of understanding. We destroyed this world. We often didn't mean to do it. Our forebears, fighting to establish themselves in what they saw as a harsh environment, were creating a national economy. But the Aboriginal world was decimated. A pattern of disease and dispossession was established. Alcohol was introduced. Social and racial differences were allowed to become fault lines. Aboriginal families were broken up. Sadly, Aboriginal health and education are responsibilities we have still yet to address successfully. I speak for all Australians in expressing a profound sorrow to the Aboriginal people. I am sorry. We are sorry. Let the world know and understand that it is with this sorrow that we as a nation will grow and seek a better, a fairer, and a wiser future. Thank you.
What do you think?
It's not the Prime Minister.
He didn't say he was. He said he was John Howard speaking to you from Sydney, Australia.
That's John Howard, the actor.
That's John Howard.
Everybody knows that's not the Prime Minister, don't they?
Everyone in Australia knows that's not the Prime Minister. What's going overseas? No one overseas knows what the Australian Prime Minister looks like. Hey, look, the building next door has closed-circuit television. I pumped the tape through there too.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
I rest my case.
Did you see that John Howard on television? It was terrific. He apologised.
He did.
Yes. Sign there, Sid.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
You've done a wonderful thing.
That's it. Thank you.
Who's Sid?
Sorry, Sid Games. How are you?
Sid who?
Sid Games.
Awesome. So, I mean, I would call that activist comedy through and through.
I think that's as good as political satire gets.
Yeah.
It's completely straight, and it's devastating.
Lorin, what was the response
The response?
in Australia, and how did it impact on you as a young person when you saw your dad do that? Right,
The response was significant. It was a Dad wrote that bit, and which is in here, and he was very. Dad was always very, we talked about form, but he always talked about as well tone in writing, and he was always aware of tone, and he loved, working with other people who, for instance, Bryan Dawe, he thought had just a fine understanding of rhythm and kind of metre and tone of voice and so on. And John Howard, the actor, was approached by Dad, who rang him personally and said, "This is my idea," and he said, "I'd love to do that." And then it came to the day of the filming, and he said, John Howard rang up and said, "I'm terribly sorry, but I'm not sure I can come in today." And the producer said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because I'm not well and my voice is going a bit, and I'm quite sick. I got the flu." And he said, "But I could come in if you like." And Dad spoke to him on the phone, and Dad said, "Come in." And he gave him he sat there with a glass of water, and he was sort of grey and ill. And then he sat in the chair, and he did that one read from start to finish with the crackly throat and the sort of vulnerable. And Dad just thought it was perfect, So I remember that. I remember that was he was very grateful to John Howard for doing that, and thought that actually kind of added to the gravitas a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the kind of comedy that is seeking to create change beyond the moment in the series that it's in. What were the things that he was concerned about? What were the things that kept him up at night?
Well, for somebody who was an enthusiast, he also was very good at being pissed off about stuff, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Political things, like the systems, the way sort of things worked. He could always analyse those things. I think that was part of what he did. And I don't really know that there was one specific thing, but he did manage to approach things with both that kind of analytical mind and was able to sort of take a step back and see the kind of funny side and the to be able to sum it up and so on. And that tone thing I was talking about earlier, he always said, he learnt a lot doing Fred Dagg because he learnt to write through performance in those early days, and the fact that those things can kind of carry you, they can do a lot. And, you know, he used to send, these guys probably can attest, emails and so on that were in a certain tone, or like you'd often get an email saying, you know, there is a bag of yours at my house. You know, I would have left a bag there by accident because I'm an idiot. There's the bag of yours at my house. I'm wondering whether or not you're going to come and pick this up. Yours, very sincerely, Concerned of Melbourne. And, you know, I'm making that up, but that was those sort of tonal things. I'm not, that was kind of how he liked to carry the whatever it was he was talking about. I think
he was very careful with his political satire, so that those on the left and those on the right copped it equally. In fact, I think, you know, if you hadn't been satirised by Clarke and Dawe, you know, you had reason to be concerned that you really didn't matter at all. So I think politicians quite enjoyed it. John was very quiet about the things that he did do. I know that he was quite involved because he did love birds so much and loved photographing birds with environmental efforts to save wetlands and all of that kind of thing. He did things in that area. But what he hated most was anything that resembled pretension or portentousness or and using language to obfuscate the truth. He couldn't stand all of that. Plus, John was he just couldn't help being funny. That was the thing. When we were editing the tournament, because it was so long and all the matches went to 5 sets and we had to fit it inside one book. And so we'd spent, I remember this vividly, we'd spent a day, you know, a morning in the office trying to lose, what could we lose, what could we cut? We went out to get some lunch and it had clouded over and you know, so one of us said, oh, God, the sun's gone in. And John said, well, just as well, otherwise we would have had to delete that too, you know. And he didn't miss a beat, you know, so it was never dull being around him, that was for sure.
Hey, there's something else I noticed watching that again this week, that scene of the apology, is that, and it's a small but very significant detail, he gives the idea of the John Howard apology to Gina, the female character. And I don't think that's an accident. And so I wanted to ask about John Clarke, the feminist, and the ally, and what it must have been like at home, you know, having surrounded by 3 women, and whether you sort of ran him through the ringer.
He did find it helpful and instructive having 2 daughters. No, well, yes, I think he was always aware of the politics and the, you know, structural unfairness and so on, and he he was always. I think that's right. I think what you're saying is right. He was aware of those things, and there are some themes in the games that are quite contemporary. So there's an athlete who changes gender between the last Olympics and this Olympics, and a bloke comes in and I don't remember where from, the committee or something, and says this is not allowed. And they ask him lots of very innocent questions about why this isn't allowed, and he says because a man is a man and a woman is a woman and things, and that just gradually gets broken down throughout the episode. And I think those, and it should be said, he wrote the games with Ross Stevenson, which was a beautiful partnership that they both enjoyed thoroughly, and which we used to call it, you know, the meetings went on for a long time because they just enjoyed one another's company so much. But yeah, I think that you can see, despite I agree the fact that he was very careful to make sure that all sides, if there are sides, were kind of sort of addressed fairly, but I think that was also that was part of that same thing, which is that structural unfairness and any kind of inconsistencies were noted. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about his relationship with fame, just for a couple of minutes, because when he left New Zealand, and we didn't really do fame in New Zealand unless you were Sir Edmund Hillary, really, or maybe an All Black, at the time of Fred Dagg. So there really was sort of no one more famous, in a sense. And then he went to broaden his horizons and his audiences. And I wondered how his experiences as Fred Dagg formed his relationship to red carpets of the future.
He wasn't a big red carpet guy, was he, Michael?
No, I mean, he didn't bring Fred Dagg with him to Australia. I've heard Sam Neill say that Australia was liberating for John because it was a foreign country that he could read and he could bring his own perspective to it. But it was also liberating because he was not a household name. He wasn't going to be mobbed walking down the street. In other words, he could discover all the different... See, the range of things that John did was just phenomenal. There was writing of all different kinds, for stage, for film, for radio, poetry, prose. Then there was the acting. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie of Death in Brunswick, the graveyard scene. It's just something. It should be against the law to be that funny, really. And directing. You know, he directed a novel that we published by a comic crime writer named Shane Maloney. So the range of things was really enormous. But I also think that John, I sort of alluded to it before, he became very famous in Australia, no mistake. But he used his face and that sort of mask and the deadpan delivery to hide behind, to say the things that actually he wanted to say through comedy. Yeah.
And he also took so much pleasure in the pomp and circumstance and ridiculousness of fame and of famous people. And I guess with last night's royal nuptials in mind, let's watch another video of the last royal wedding.
Time now for John Clarke and Bryan Dawe.
Thanks for your time tonight.
Oh, great pleasure to be talking with you. Good evening.
Terrific. And how's the weather over there?
Beautiful, beautiful. Been a bit iffy lately, but beautiful today.
Yeah, and it'd be daytime there, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it must be night time there, is it?
Yes, it is.
Yes, that explains it. Yes.
So, Shane Warne and Liz Hurley.
Yeah, what a fantastic story this is becoming. This is just a fantastic story.
Yeah, you only get one of these every...
half an hour.
I was going to say generation.
Yeah, sorry, Brian, I'm talking to someone else. I'll be about half an hour. Now, then they can use the studio. I'm just talking to Brian.
So what are the details? Give us the details.
Well, apparently Shane has proposed.
Shane has?
Yeah, apparently.
Right. Sorry, what do you mean apparently?
Well, I mean it appears.
It appears...
It appears.
It appears where?
The story?
Yeah.
On this piece of paper.
Where?
After apparently. Apparently, Shane has proposed to Liz Hurley. Apparently, it says here, he's proposed.
Okay, so what you really mean is been reported?
Yeah, it's been reported.
And who reported it?
I did. I made it up. No, you can have some. It's cordial. Have as much as you like. No, don't go and get coffee. Have that.
Excuse me. Hang
on.
Sorry. Can I just clarify something? It has been reported that Shane has proposed
reportedly.
to Liz Hurley.
I'm reporting something that was reportedly reported by reporters. Reporters have reportedly reported this, and I'm reporting it to you.
Right.
It's been reported that it's the case.
Right, that Shane has proposed to Liz Hurley.
That's right, that he's proposed to her, yes.
And hasn't that been denied?
It has been denied, yes.
So doesn't that mean it's not true?
No, it means the story's balanced. We're very keen on balance.
Yeah, but which one's not true?
Sorry, Brian, you're breaking up. I can hardly hear you.
So have you spoken to Shane or Liz?
I've spoken to Shane, haven't spoken to Liz, but yes, I've certainly spoken to Shane.
Right, recently, this week?
Recently, but no, not this week, no.
When was it that you last spoke to him?
2005, I believe it was.
And where was this?
It's at the Oval, Brian. He'd dropped a catch.
And you yelled something out to him?
Yeah, I'd had a couple, Brian. It's probably not my finest hour, and I'm not proud of it, but...
this is 6 years ago.
It is. And the Liz thing, I must say, didn't crop up, Brian. We didn't get to that in the discourse in which we engaged at the time.
Right, terrific. Well, look, thank you very much for your time.
It's a fantastic story, though, yeah.
It is a great story.
Yeah.
And keep in touch with us.
Get away with it? Yeah, I'll get away with it. This story will be huge in Australia. Ever seen an Australian newspaper?
So, Michael and Lorin, you worked together on Tinkerings, this wonderful book of John Clarke writings, a lot of which we've seen before, but some of which will be new to a lot of people. When did you start that process, and how was it for you? How did you work together?
We were laughing about this before because Lorin has small people in her life. So the editorial conversations were something like, oh, look, I thought, Lorin, we might do this. Well, Michael, I was thinking, would you get down from that now, please? We did it in a very compressed period of time last year, 2 or 3 months, and originally it was going to be one book, and then it became clear that wasn't going to do justice to the material. We'd already published the poetry separately, and the tournament, of course, is a book in itself. But it became clear we think there are about 1 million words of Clarke and Dawe interviews. So it was a 30-year project. And the really interesting thing was you would go back to the interviews in the 1980s, but it would be quite reasonable to assume that they'd lost their bite. The politicians were long gone. The issues that were being satirised were long gone. But because of John's really, really razor-sharp attention to the shape of these things, they were just as funny now as they were then. So they turned into quite a big book. And then we worked together to put Tinkering. And if there's one thing I sort of the Tinkering says, it was just John was he's such a brilliant performer. It's easy to forget that he was also a brilliant writer. And Tinkering really preserves inside one book the way he just honed language to make it work. So I don't know. And I had this feeling, which I described to Lorin, particularly when I was doing the interviews, that John was sitting on my shoulder saying, no, it's just not quite good enough now. We'll leave that one out, but don't forget about that one. It was, I really felt that I was channeling him, and I know why. I know why. It was because that sense of his voice is so inscribed into everything that he wrote that I could hear him as we were going through the material.
Yeah, it wasn't difficult because, we both know him very well, but also, the material... Well, it's interesting, the Clarke and Dawe, which is a pleasure to be here, it's a different book, but in the last, 10 years or something, Dad, who was very keen on... Who was sort of very forward... thinking about the digital space and so on, there's a Clarke and Dawe, YouTube channel and things like that, and so they'd go up online every week and so on, and it's amazing how many comments underneath are, I'm from Finland, I have no idea who these people are or who they're talking about, but this is bloody funny. And, I'm from, and that's interesting because it's that same thing as you were saying before about the things from the 80s still, which is kind of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about tone and form, that as long as that's clear and your kind of satirical point is being made within that, people get it, and I think that's what's special about the Pleasure to Be Here book.
And the other thing too was, in the last few years, John had started doing quite different kinds of writing. He wrote essays about his parents, which are very beautiful.
Which start the book, which is a beautiful place to put them.
Yeah. And he also wrote, just in the last year or two, he started doing these sort of meditative reflections, apparently quite random, things that he remembered, one subject floating into another, and he was publishing these in Meanjin in Melbourne, and they actually closed the book out so that Tinkering is able to reflect the many moods of his writing, not just the outrageously funny stuff.
I was wondering if you'd indulge me and read the first paragraph of the Auden chapter.
Which one?
On the right-hand side. This. Just that first paragraph.
The opening paragraph?
Yeah.
Across southern Australia there is a beautiful tree called leucopogon. If you Google it and find a picture, you'll realise you know it quite well. The leucopogon seed can germinate only once it has passed through the gut of a bird. The bird eats the seed, softening it through digestion, so that when it drops on the ground it can open and grow. 20th century poetry is the leucopogon tree. W.H. Auden is the bird. Next slide, please.
Isn't that gorgeous? Yeah, there's so much in here. And Lorin, I mean, I really ought to tell everybody to just buy the book, but in your introduction, you talk a little bit about your relationship as a writer, with John as a writer, and your emails to each other and how you would edit each other. And could you...
Yeah, Dad, Michael would... This is familiar to Michael, but it's familiar to lots of Dad's friends and so on. He often would collaborate. You know, he liked the idea that he was collaborating with his audience, and he liked sending something to people. And the whole word tinkering and where that came from is that he used to say, "I'm just going to have a bit of a tinker. Leave it with me. I'll have a bit of a tinker, and I'll get it back to you." And he was constantly tinkering, so that he'd go over it and over it, and it was a joyful process, you know, and a creative process. And I think he learnt a lot from having done a lot of stuff himself in the early days, so that he'd learnt how to edit when he was learning how to perform, and he was learning how to write, so that by the end of his career he had a really good grasp of how all of the stages worked. And my mum's a writer as well, and my sister works with words. And so in our family, we'd send emails to each other with, this is a thing I'm doing, it's due Friday. And his, to me, and to everyone in the family, always said the headline, the email subject line would just be "Wodges," which was short for "What do you reckon?" Wodges. And so if I ever need to this day find a draft of something, I'll just type "Wodges" into my Gmail, and 50 million kind of works in progress will come up. And a very unhelpful filing system. But that process was, I think, really helpful to him and really helpful to me, because it sorts you out pretty swiftly when you've got someone like Michael or all the people he sort of trusted to bounce off your ideas against. And the idea that things are kind of a collaborative work in progress is an idea that I think he greatly enjoyed. Yeah.
We are fast running out of time, and we have to finish with a song. So, but before we do that, I feel like we need a bit of a joyous g'day to the spirit of John Clarke. So if you could all, on 3, 2, 1, yell out g'day. That'll just bring us all together to end this beautiful session. 3, 2, 1. G'day. Feels good, doesn't it? I'm sorry we can't talk for another hour, but from me, from Tom, from Michael, from Lorin, from Text Publishing and the Australian High Commission and the Auckland Writers' Festival, we're so happy to have had you all in the room and to celebrate the late, very bloody great John Clarke. And let's finish with his beloved creation, Mr. Fred Dagg.
And now the delegate from New Zealand, Mr. Fred Dagg.
Tom Scott, Michael Heyward, Lorin Clarke.
You've been listening to a podcast from the 2018 Auckland Writers' Festival. You can find a range of other festival talks, interviews and discussions on iTunes and SoundCloud and on our website writersfestival.co.nz.